Let's talk about Israel. Before we dig deep into this issue, let me give you a brief historical view of Israel and especially Jerusalem and its importance for different religions. Whenever we talk about Israel, there are few things which are important to discuss. Number one, the Jewish people itself, their demands and the causes of their present conflict with Palestine, and the Jerusalem city itself. Thousands years before the Christ, King David, united with 12 tribes of Israel, captured Jerusalem. His son Solomon built the first temple right there. It was later destroyed and built on the second temple there. Then came the catastrophic year for Jews 70 AD when the Romans destroyed their temple and ushered in a diaspora. That's when the Jews became a people without land and dispersed throughout the world. In fact, when religion is involved, the conflict is mostly about groups of people who claim the same land. After centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw the historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decade of 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the British and French empires caved up Middle East, with British taking control of the region it called the British Mandate of Palestine. At first, British allowed Jews immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling in farming communes, tension between Jews and Arab grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jews immigration, and in response to Jews militia formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist the British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, sectarian violence between the Jews and Arabs grew. The UN approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, for Jews, Israel, and for Arabs, Palestine. So before we head further, let me give you a very solid reason that why the capital of this Israel is important in this context. For so many people, Jerusalem is the closest place on the earth to heaven. For sake of Israel, Israeli Jews, Temple Mount is the holiest place in the Judaism, and especially their western wall, which is also lies in this city. And this wall is the source of inspiration and spiritual satisfaction for them. At the same time, the Dome of the Rock is treasured by the Muslims, that Muslims believe that they belong to this place and they have their historical traces there. Another thing that is important in context of Jerusalem, that is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that is also important for the Christians. So it was after the 1947 when the UN plan approved the two divisions of states, number one, Israel for the Jews and the Palestine for Arabs. City of Jerusalem, where Jews and Muslims and Christians all have holy sites, it was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. When Israel established, the Jews established the plan and declared independence as Israel. Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. At the same time, in after just 1 year, Arab-Israel war broke out. Many of Arab-Israel states who just recently won independence themselves declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all British Palestine had been The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of the Jerusalem and most of the land that was not in their part. They also expelled huge number of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about plus 17 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israel conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled or in the Israel. Then something happened to transform this conflict. The 1967, the Six-Day War. Israel neighboring Arab states fought another war. Israel seized Golan Heights from the Syria, West Bank from the Jordan, Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula of the Egypt. Now Israel was occupying the Palestinian territories, including all the Jerusalem and its holy sites. In 1978, the issue was further transformed when US brokered a deal to pacify this issue. They came up with the Camp David Accord, after which the Israel gave back Sinai to Egypt as a sign of peace, which was hugely controversial in Arab world and which resulted into the assassination of the president of the Egypt. To world surprise, the issue wasn't resolved yet. And this was the idea was taken up by the Bill Clinton, and he came up with another accord in 1990s, Oslo Accord. He decided to establish Palestinian government and divide West Bank in three sections. He proposed three areas: an area A, for which he gave Palestinian total control over the security and government. It was 18% of the West Bank. This gave Palestinians self-rule for the first time. Area B was designed for Palestinian government control while retaining Israel's security control, and it was the 22% of the West Bank, meaning Israeli military remains very present. The section C remained completely under Israeli military and the government control, and it was the 60% of the West Bank. Area C contains the majority of the West Bank agricultural land as well as the water and mineral resources. Many of the first Jewish settlers who trickled out here in 1967 were driven by the strong ideology to claim the land for the Israel. And this was the scenario which is led to further conflict between the Arab and the Israel. Given these facts, the future of the Palestine-Israel issue is still unpredictable. Nothing can be determined at this stage when both countries are deciding their fate, and at the same time US has not clearly shown its position over the issue, especially since Biden has assumed